Good evening, everyone. Time for another silver update. This is the 4-hour chart of silver. You can see from the trend lines that I've drawn, we seem to be strengthening in this rising pennant formation. It's not fully a cup formation, but it does seem to be rising, looking for a breakout above this trend line and hopefully to see a continuation pattern up to the old highs. We have the overhang of this resistance level here to get through, and you can see we almost tested it, but we turned around and went down. So this is going to be our next test of resistance when we get back to the 45 level, roughly, if we can get through that. A lot of projections are being made for $50 by the end of the year. I'm going to stick by my projection that we're going to reach $100 by the end of the year once we get through 50. I may be wrong, and we'll have to wait and see. On the gold chart, we are consolidating in a series of violent moves that have really increased the volatility of gold in the last few days. A lot of people observed the double tops that seem to be created by the recent news announcements regarding the Swiss franc and the German legislature and some of the activities that are coming out of Europe, and a lot of people were speculating that it looks like they're trying to put in a strong double top formation. It's really not looking like that now. We look closely at this pattern. It also seems to be a rising pennant formation. So my expectation is it'll probably be penetrated to the upside here as we move probably quite rapidly towards $2,000. We'll wait and see how long it takes for that to be the case. I wanted to address the two speeches that we had today. Kind of a historic day in the sense that we had both the Chairman of the Federal Reserve and the President of the United States giving speeches. In my opinion, very disappointing speeches by both of them. Very confusing, especially after the long and drawn out and very acrimonious debate that we had at the beginning of August regarding the raising of the debt ceiling. And then to see the result of that being these speeches, which I'll go into some of the text of some of these two speeches. But I wanted to try to give you an idea of the type of principle that I think comes out pretty clear in both of these speeches. I'm going to call this the principle of Wimpy economics. And if you remember, Wimpy was a character in the Popeye cartoon series. I'll read you this statement from Wimpy. Wimpy says, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today." The etymology is from the cartoon Popeye, where the character Wimpy would frequently utter this phrase. He was a glutton and would consume burgers at a ferocious rate, but could rarely pay for his habit. The phrase implies the underlying feeling that the person will unlikely actually pay for the hamburger or whatever on Tuesday, or ever for that matter. So I've pulled the full text of both the Bernanke and the Obama speeches. The full text of the Bernanke speech is on this federalreserve.gov site, and the Obama speech I've pulled from the Zero Hedge site, and I've just chosen a couple of sections to highlight this. I want to point out this idea. So let's start off with the Bernanke speech, and it's really, frankly, it's just an amazing amalgam of nonsense. It's really surprising. This is the leadership of the United States, that the leadership of the United States could spew this kind of confused nonsense is very shocking and disheartening. But I want to get down to a section that highlights what I'm trying to point out, that they seem to be very confused, and they have been for seemingly at least the last 3 years of this crisis, if we're still in a crisis, but we supposedly left a crisis in June of 2009, so that's confusing in and of itself. But both Bernanke and Obama seem to be saying that the way we're going to get out of this thing and return to full growth is by increasing government spending now to be offset by government cuts in the future. So let's look at this section of the Bernanke speech. He says, while the weakness of the housing sector and continued financial volatility are two key reasons for the frustratingly slow pace of the recovery, other factors also may restrain growth in the coming quarters. For example, state and local governments continue to tighten their belts by cutting spending and reducing payrolls in the face of ongoing budgetary pressures, and federal fiscal stimulus is being withdrawn. There's ample room for debate about the appropriate size and role for the government in the longer term. In other words, let's talk about that later. But in the absence of adequate demand from the private sector, a substantial fiscal consolidation in the shorter term could add to the headwinds facing economic growth and hiring. Now, that's a confused mess. Let me try to parse out what he's saying. So he's saying that the pace of the recovery is slow, and it's being slowed down by the fact that state and local governments have found that they've run out of money. And since they've run out of money, they're beginning to lay people off, and the laying off of government workers is slowing the recovery. So we need to hire more government workers. That's the implication. And he goes further into, he says, the prospect of an increasing fiscal drag, I would think the fiscal drag would be the cost of government, but I guess not. The fiscal drag on the economy in the face of an already sluggish recovery highlights one of the many difficult trade-offs currently faced by fiscal policymakers. As I've emphasized on previous occasions, without significant policy changes to address the increasing fiscal burdens that will be associated with the aging of the population and the ongoing rise in healthcare costs, the finances of the federal government will spiral out of control in the coming decades. I thought the finances are spiraling out of control right now. Aren't we running a $1.5 trillion yearly deficit? I think isn't that spiraling out of control? Under Bush, weren't we running 300 and 400, and under Clinton 200 and 300? Now we're running 1.5. I would say that's spiraling out of control, risking severe economic and financial damage. But while prompt and decisive action to put the federal government's finances on a sustainable trajectory is urgently needed, fiscal policymakers should not, as a consequence, disregard the fragility of the economic recovery. Fortunately, the two goals, achieving fiscal sustainability, which is a result of responsible policies set in place for the longer term, and avoiding creation of fiscal headwinds for the recovery, are not incompatible. Acting now to put in place a credible plan for reducing future deficits over the long term, while being attentive to the implications of fiscal choices for the recovery in the near term, can help solve both objectives. Okay, so he's saying that we need to spend more now. We need to raise taxes or borrow more and spend more now so that we can spend less in the future. So obviously a just confused mess of thinking. Of course, this is the Bernanke that was unable to predict any of the financial downturn, although he goes ahead and takes credit for predicting it, even though he didn't. And so I'm going to give this an F as far as a speech. This is just horrendous. More of the same. Not surprising. So let's jump over to Obama's speech, and we see more of this same bizarre type of Keynesian thinking that we need to spend more now so we can spend less later. Obama says, this is the American Jobs Act. It will lead to new jobs for, and let's look who it's for, construction workers, teachers, veterans, first responders, young people, and the long-term unemployed. So the way they're going to create jobs is to have the government spend money. Not reduce the amount of government spend so that the private sector has more savings that can fund capital investment, which will ultimately create jobs in the private sector. No, they're going to tax and spend more. It will provide tax credits to companies that hire new workers, tax relief for small business owners, and tax cuts for the middle class. And here's the other thing I want the American people to know. The American Jobs Act will not add to the deficit. Please hold your laughter. It will be paid for. And here's how. The agreement we passed in July will cut government spending by about $1 trillion over the next 10 years. It also charges this Congress to come up with an additional $1.5 trillion in savings by Christmas. You mean $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. Tonight I'm asking you to increase that amount so that it covers the full cost of the American Jobs Act. So I'm asking you to increase the amount that you cut in the future to cover the increased spending that I'm proposing now. And a week from Monday, I'll be releasing a more ambitious deficit plan, a plan that will not only cover the cost of this jobs bill, but stabilize our debt in the long run. This approach is basically the one I've been advocating for months. In addition to the $1 trillion of spending cuts I've already signed into law, it's a balanced plan that would reduce the deficit by making additional spending cuts, by making modest adjustments to health care programs like Medicare and Medicaid, and by reforming our tax code in a way that asks the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations to pay their fair share. So that's a tax increase. What's more, the spending cuts wouldn't happen so abruptly that they'd be a drag on our economy or prevent us from helping small businesses and middle-class families get back on their feet right away. So, here's Wimpy again. I will gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today. So you can see that both Obama and Bernanke are parroting these same bankrupt Keynesian ideas have failed. I can't even count the times. Do you remember Shovel Ready? Do you remember all of these? We don't even know what happened to all that money. It's gone. We know that the national debt has basically doubled since Obama has taken office, and what do we have to show for it? Not a lot. We just need to spend more money. So, very disappointing, but very good news for the precious metals. Obviously, the leaders of our government have shown that they have absolutely no intent of reining in spending. And as I covered in my video yesterday about how the government plans to rob the savers to create this money, it seems obvious that they have no intent of turning around and admitting that the policies they've been following are slowly grinding the economy down into a state where only printing massive amounts of money is going to keep it running, and they fully intend to do that, which is going to cause gold and silver to spike to the moon. And I think with their determination, they're going to print up enough money to make that happen, at least by next year. And we'll talk to you next time.